Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce Gerrit to present Spring in Autumn with Neo4j. Over to you, Gerrit.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. And good morning, good evening, good night to everybody who's listening in. Nice conference this far, I would say. Glad to have you here. I want to talk with you about Spring. You might have know Spring, you might know Spring. You might never heard of it. You're a Java developer, but you want to get started with enterprise applications. And over the past years, we started a lot of Spring projects internally, but we also contributed a lot to Spring projects in the broader ecosystem. And that's what I want to talk about today. If you want to follow along, there is a Git repository with most of the examples I present today. So if you want to see if I'm lying, etc., or something is not working for you, you will later get also a link where you can talk with me in our forums, and you have a nice example to get started if you want to get started with some of those projects you see today. Short about me, most of the time at Neo4j I work at Spring Data for Spring Data Neo4j project. Also, my colleague Michael Simons and me, we worked before with Spring, so it was very natural for us to also take over this responsibility for the Spring project. In my other life at Neo4j, I work as a sidekick in the connectors team. If you want to reach out to me, there are a few coordinates. You can see me or find me. So why the Spring ecosystem? I think an interesting part of the Spring ecosystem is that it has multiple projects. So if you have just, for example, you will see this, a small project that instantiates some beans, you can take another project that builds upon this. So you can see this as a puzzle. So you put several parts or features, namely now those projects together, and everything will work and play really well together. So I thought today we take a full amount of features we developed or helped develop, contributed to in the Spring ecosystem to get you started with the wide size, wide features you want to see in your project or in your application. And then you can choose and pick and choose what you want, what you don't want, and so on. So let's start simple. So you have a Spring project and you just want to connect to Neo4j. Typically, we do this via the driver. So there was a great introduction of an hour ago or something about the Java driver. And if we take our new application that you start.spring.io, and we just define a driver dependency, we already created some auto configuration for Spring Boot that it will configure the driver if you provide the right coordinates to connect to. So as the easiest example, you have some UI, your Aura instance, for example, your credentials, and then you will get not only a driver object, but you automatically will get health endpoints, for example. You also could get metrics if you include micrometer. You might have seen already the presentation by Dimitri and Greg, where they showed off the metrics. So you get also all of this right out of the box by just defining the driver. And last but not least, as I said, this health endpoint, for example, makes use of this pre-configured driver that you can inject into your application. So thinking about what could I do next with this driver object? I mean, I have a connection to Neo4j. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm working for Spring Data Neo4j project. Object mapping. So we take this driver object, and if you just add now the boot starter for Spring Data Neo4j, you will get object mapping right out of the box. So typically you have some problem domain, In this example, in most of the slides, we take this movie example, the Play Movies guide that you get with the browser. And you map some Java classes or records. With the right metadata, you know, okay, this is the ID. That's a bad example, but it's short for the slides. So please don't repeat this, because we now assume that the name is unique and the title is unique. And you draw some relationships between them. So a person acted in movies. So we are just interested in the actors right now. With this, you can define such repositories. For example, a person repository, where you don't have to do anything, but you can define custom methods like the find by name, and we will create all the cipher you need. So it's really for you, if you are just a starter with Neo4j, simple if you don't want to jump in not only into the new technology Spring Data Neo4j and Neo4j itself, but also don't want to now learn also cipher. So for the first bits, this is really, really nice to get an entry into the Neo4j world. So we will produce this cipher. With the repository, you get find all, delete, update mechanisms, where you can just work with your Java objects. Find by name, for example, will create a condition. So we look for persons with the matching name. Putting this into a small bean that we call on startup of our Java application or Spring application, we will see that you can now get, for example, Lawrence Fishburne, when we search for him, with all the movies connected. Because we have the record, we get a nice or semi-nice toString method that you can work with. That's cool. That's Spring Data Neo4j in a nutshell. But typically, you want to access your data. You don't only want to have your data within your application. You want to expose it, manipulate it from the outside. And typically, what you would do, be it Jakarta or Spring, you would create controllers. So you can make REST calls, for example, to manipulate this data. But having all of this functionality already existing in Spring Data Neo4j, we can now expose our repositories also to Spring Data REST. That's another project, and as you might guess, it's just another dependency you have to throw in. So there's also a starter for this. So you put in Spring Data REST and our repository that we have just store. So no annotations needed here. And if I call now the endpoint of my application, because it starts also a web server, I already get some hints where I could go to. For example, the first response is the persons, something that we call persons here. If you don't like this generic plural, you can also modify this. For example, we can say, okay, we call it people. So we have now the people endpoint. There's, as you see, some customization possible, of course. And with this people endpoint, if we call this, we get our actors back. This would be the list of all actors, but slides are limited, so please believe me. And with this people endpoint, after the list of all persons or actors, you also get further links. So per default, we only get a limited list or page of 20 entries. But now we get also the information how to go to the next page, where's the last page and the first page. And there's a tiny bit at the end before we get the summary. This is a search endpoint. This search endpoint is also exposing, if we look at this, the find by name method. As you can see in the example above, I can now call the method that I have just defined in the REST with the REST API, and then, for example, say, hey, I want to query for Lawrence Fishburne. Having said this, you might guess you can also manipulate, delete, update your data this way, but limited time. Yay. It's maybe you are so interested in that you can figure this out for yourself when you look at the example. Additional feature of the Spring Data REST module, it has support for the Spring Data projections. That means that you can also slice your data, how you want to export it. You can also slice just the responses. So if you are familiar with the Jackson object mapper, you get the right annotations to minimize the exported data, or to reduce the amount of round trips or self-references that you might run into a Stack Overflow or something. If your Java object graph contains such logical cycles. Also, you get some callbacks. So Spring Data REST can intercept before data manipulation calls or post data manipulation calls to adjust the data if it not in the right format that you would expect for Spring Data Neo4j to process. Also, since it's an web endpoint, it supports Spring Security out of the box. And that would be another puzzle piece within the whole process. But now we have a REST endpoint, and the manager says, oh, no, I heard about this GraphQL thing. So if you want to use GraphQL, you're also free to do this because there's a Spring project for this. So as you might guess, you add another starter, or you remove, for example, the Spring Data REST starter, and you put in the GraphQL starter. And with this GraphQL starter, you could do quite the same. You need now an annotation to say, I want to export my repository as a GraphQL repository, and you give it a scheme. So if you're familiar with GraphQL, it likes to have schemes, also for your Explorer to see the data that you want to expose. And with those information, if you start up your or restart your application, you already get your GraphQL endpoint. So there are more details I come to in some slides, but this is all it needs, for example, to draw or recreate our Java object world for GraphQL. The nice thing about this GraphQL integration in Spring Boot, when a Spring application is, that you also get a GraphQL endpoint if you want. So you have to enable it explicitly, but you also get this browser-like endpoint where you can test if your data gets exported correctly, etc. If you don't do this, you can typically use curl or something to make your post requests for your queries. So having said this, we do quite the same. So we want to have now all the people, all names with their movies. And within those movies, since this data is baked with an, let's say, wrapper object for the relationships in Spring Data Neo4j already that I haven't shown, we see the roles. The people play in the various movies as the movie titles or title of the movies where they have those roles. So the repetition of Neo, for example, in this case is that Keanu Reeves played Neo multiple times in multiple parts of the Matrix series. Also, if we should agree that there's only one, but that's another topic. Also here, we have additional features in the GraphQL library that also then reflects back to Spring Data Neo4j. We have those schema query and batch mapping. That means that you can still, even though everything looks like it's working out of the box, it is working out of the box. But if you want to customize something like custom query endpoint or things like this, you can still write your controller, annotate it, and say, okay, this is a batch operation, for example, where I fetch a bunch of data in one go. Or I have a custom schema that I want to return. You can still do this by hand. So it's not that this automagical created endpoints are fixed. You can still tune it as you want. Also, in one of the last releases of Spring Data Neo4j, we added support for GraphQL callbacks regarding paging and scrolling. So your schema might get a little bit more complex in the definition, but you can then also say, okay, I want to have paging support, scrolling support for my results. And this is working pretty nice. And I haven't shown the example where we query, for example, just for JSON Fishburne, where you have parameters to pass, to query, to filter your data or put a condition in. But you can also do this with a little bit of customization in your repository to say, okay, I want to have query by example support, things like this. This is working pretty well out of the box. I won't tell you anything that I cannot promise. And now we come to the big elephant in the room. Woo! So you're not interested in exposing the data of your application. You want to inspect the data of your application, or you want to query the data in a nice way. There is a new project called SpringAI, not so new anymore, but pretty new for if we compare this to the lifespan of the other projects that we have in here, like Spring Data, Spring Data REST, Spring for GraphQL. Also in Spring Data for Spring Data AI, the core maintainer asked us if we could provide a Neo4j support. That means that everything that relates to vector database operations will be called within Neo4j. And it's also beneficial because you can work with your own data, be it data creation, be it querying, whatever. To do this, yes, it's easy as you see this here. You add the vector store support for Neo4j. Okay, now we have a vector store support where you can store vectors or retrieve vectors. Yes, there might be another dependency you need. In this case, you would have to put a dependency for your beloved machine. For my example, in there, it's just the local Olama installation, and we can work with this. So to create the data for existing content in the database, as I said, we have this movies example database in there. We query with the driver all the records that we have for a movie. We extract the plot of a movie and then put it as a so-called document back to the graph. And typically a document contains of identifier and a text and some metadata. Maybe, just maybe, because it's a general purpose model, I used here the movie ID as also the ID of the document, just to have a later reference for mapping those data. Mapping those data together with the matching movies. And there was this more or less innocent call that you see at the bottom of this example, vector store add. And this will take care of invoking the LLM to pass the text and to store this with the right call, then the part of the Neo4j vector store as the correct vector types within Neo4j. And if we have the data now in the database, we can, for example, expose it via REST call to say, okay, I want to execute a similarity search on all the entries that I have in my vector or in my vector index, because it's working with one vector index at the moment, and I want to get all plots back or movie plots back, so I know the title and the plot that you're referring to. And this works pretty well. With this created endpoint in the controller, I can then, for example, use search for heartful child story or child stories, and see what Llama 3.1 brings as a surprise. So we get Cloud Atlas. Yay! You could see it as a cloud story, but we also get Green Mile. So yeah, even though we are working with trusted data, you also have to trust the vectors that you can generate. Maybe it's not the expected result in most of the cases if your kid's just shouting out, hey, we want to see a nice movie. And you say, okay, I want to present you a heartful child story. Yeah. And coming back to the second project I mentioned, Spring Data Neo4j, in the upcoming version in a few weeks, you will also get vector search support directly in Spring Data Neo4j. So Spring Data Neo4j will access the vector within Neo4j that you provide, and then do the search on our search functionality for vectors within Neo4j. You can combine this with all the known filters like name or something. So you could really say find by vector and name or whatever, and you will get a filtered down result. Yeah. But this comes in a few weeks, as I said, and it does not require you to map the vector. So it's just working on the index itself on the database side. So you are not transferring a lot of data between the client, your application, and the Neo4j database. And yeah, also there are a lot of features. Shared memory support, also with a dedicated module for Neo4j. So the chat client you're talking with does not forget this fast what you talked about. Then there is MCP client and server that's completely isolated from Neo4j, or from a vector database specification. It's more like it's there. You can implement your own calls, for example, reach into a Neo4j database. It's still possible, but you have to do it on your own. And it has the WAC module. So for large text files, etc., that you get the right content. And with this, we come to the last Spring project I want to present to you. This is unfortunately not part of the example project because there are nowadays so much new features in the upcoming version that it does not make sense to just mix it into the example application. So Spring Modelless, the idea behind Spring Modelless is that you create your application out of modules. That does not mean that you have microservices or something like this, but you have a clear separation, architectural separation between concerns within your application. And one of the driving points that pulled us into this project was that the core maintainer of this project reached out to us and asked, hey, we need something to store the data. We have something for SQL databases. Do you want to provide the Neo4j integration? And we said, okay, let's do this. So this means you have a stateful application event library. And those events are stored within Neo4j during the time of process. This, as in this example, we have this order example where an order management service says, okay, I want to complete an order. And it just creates an event. So it emits an event that gets stored in Neo4j. And there's another service, the inventory management service, that are looking for those events within the database. And if one of those events appear, it will then start with this work. So this architectural approach helps you to remove direct relationships or dependencies within your components of your application. Also, those events can be set to canceled, failed, of course, succeeded, and things like this. And you will also get timings for event changes in there. And a nice byproduct of having the Spring Modelless library in there, if you enable the documentation creation process, is that you, for this very small application, you also get an architectural diagram. So which module is listening for another module? In this case, it's pretty easy because the inventory management system has this module listener and only listens for this one type of events that comes out of the order management. So, of course, as in for every example here, there's more. We have verification calls for testing so that your modules are really separated, and this will fail if it does not work. You can work with time spans. That means that you can also see if an event was created an hour ago, and then you can react on this, still re-emitted or something else. And you get also the ability to introduce a little bit of observability and tracing in your application to see how the event gets processed by every service. So having said this, those are all the Spring modules I could think of when I prepared the talk. There might be some more, like Spring Batch support for Neo4j or similar. But yeah, we don't have this much time, so I picked the most interesting ones for me, at least. Looking at the broader ecosystem, and now we need to speed up a little bit. Those driver creation things that you have seen in the beginning, with where you just throw in the dependency for the Java driver, and some configuration is not exclusive to Spring or Spring Boot. We have this for Micronaut, Quarkus, and Helidon in place. There are other projects if you want to use object mapping pure on the Java way. We have Neo4j OGM still developed, but without Spring dependencies. There's also a module for Quarkus, so you can do it also the Jakarta way. There's Neo4j migrations for database migrations with a Spring Boot starter. Those are those icons that you see there. Testcontainers also has fabulous support for Spring Boot. So you get the service containers. We have the JDBC driver, and yeah, shout out to Eugene, who will give a talk in half an hour about the JDBC driver and how to use it for using Flink. And last but not least, Cypher DSL, the thing that most of those libraries built upon to create Cypher. So we don't do string concatenation in Spring Data Neo4j, for example, to create the queries, but we let the Cypher DSL build this also with Neo4j version awareness. And I think that's all. Thank you. Whew, we made it. 2 minutes left. So if you have any questions, reach out now. If Michael did not answer everything already, you can also find me at the community, and not only me, but also all the other nice people from Neo4j. And yeah, and I can only finish this presentation with a bad joke. So Spring Boot is like jumping boat in German. So that's why you see now a GIF of a springing boat. Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot for your attention. And if there are any questions, I don't know. I see only colleagues. I think everything is answered. Yes. So yeah, thanks for your attention. Hope you have a lot of fun at the conference. And don't forget Eugene's talk and all the other ones. Thanks.